Hey, it's Cash B, soon to be SLP, and you're listening to the S.L.P Project. This episode is titled Education's Influence, and we'll be discussing the impact of education on features of language and its use. This episode was previously recorded with my friend Iman Scott, and it was actually an inspiration to start my own podcast. Happy listening.
Welcome, Kayshawn Brown. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for asking. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm super excited. I'm so thankful that you are taking time to talk with me today and record this podcast.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject.
Yes, 100%. And I think it's going to be a great conversation, especially with your background in linguistics.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. So, our topic question today is how does education affect the features of language that people use? So, I thought that was a really interesting question because thinking personally, I think education has impacted my family and how my family uses language in a lot of ways. Thinking back to my grandmother. My grandma's a teacher too, or she was a teacher when she was younger, actually. And so at a certain point when she was younger, someone told her that this certain way of speaking, like African American English and Ebonics, was wrong and incorrect. And she takes that, internalizes that, teaches that to her students. And of course, she's teaching this to her students with the mindset that she's helping them get ahead and this is how it has to be, and teaches that to her students, teaches that to her children. And this becomes like a generational impact on how this family speaks, how this Southern family changes their dialect and assimilates into what's considered like the premier language or premier dialect.
Yeah, I think it definitely pushes this ideology that in order for you to move up in the world, like to
Mm,
move forward, the only way is for you to sound a certain way. When, especially in education, I feel like we've all had, like us being Black American women, I think
mm.
we've all had these teachers that are quick to correct you and waste time with ax versus ask
Yes.
and all these grammatical influences that AAVE has that teachers in education diminish because of like the generational influence that pushing that has been pushed onto uh, us as a society.
Yeah, 100%. And so the language ideologies that a lot of teachers have, like you said, is goes along with what I say my grandma has learned, and so many people, so many African Americans, and not just African Americans, but other people of color in America have learned is supposed to be the quote unquote right way and the best way of speaking. In one of my textbooks, it's Language and Power in Post-Colonial Schooling. The author is McKinney. And so they discuss teaching ideologies, and they're looking at schools in South Africa, I believe. And so they're thinking about the language ideologies in these schools, and they see through interviewing and talking to these teachers that the teachers have this hot place, this higher prestige on the variety of dialects that are closer related to whiteness in their country, and that they kind of look down on the African languages and how those African communities are speaking and communicating and how that impacts the students. It's like the teachers there are teaching the other students how to treat these dialects as well. And that's impacting in the classroom. And McKinney goes on to talk about how that impacts the students' language ideologies. And we see it's like the teachers are empowering their students to further oppress the language of their peers in this way because they're just letting this happen and they're even teaching it.
Absolutely. And I think that in many cases, the majority language is seen as more economically prestigious. And oftentimes it leads individuals to prioritize that language's acquisition and that language's use as opposed to other minority language or like their native language, which might happen to be a minority. Like the societal pressure that we were talking about earlier
Mhm.
can marginalize minority languages. And individuals might perceive them as less valuable or useful in terms of like education, social mobility, employment,
Mhm.
like, yeah.
Exactly. And so, as Black Americans, so how we internalize that as children, like you're saying, goes forth in how we enter the world. It's like, how were how was I taught to speak, how to be a good interviewee? I was taught how to assimilate into a culture and how to move ahead. That's what was valued in my family, and then what I was taught to value going forth. Right before we started, I asked you about the Twitter page HBCU Confessions. And so this is a page where people from HBCUs all over the country just go and say kind of wild stuff. But this tweet I saw just yesterday was so interesting. This person said, just because I don't use AAVE does not mean I'm anti-Black. I don't say phrases like period. So my friends think I hate Black culture, but my parents always taught me to speak proper English. I'm like,
Hmm.
well, and they were getting ate up in the comments.
Well, let's talk about that though, because when does code switching, when do you really start learning to code switch?
mm,
Isn't it in the classroom?
yeah, oh, 100%. I think it's
Yeah,
definitely in the classroom from a young age. Your teacher said, don't say it like that. Like with the habitual B, if the student comes in is like, oh, I've been doing this, and the teacher's going to correct. Like, what's the teacher going to do? The teacher thinks something here is wrong because they don't recognize AAE or any alternative dialects. So like, okay, you're supposed to say it like this, and just begin immediately telling this child they're wrong. And how does that impact the child and how they think of their language? I think we see it with this person who sent the tweet. Like, this is the impact of how she's been raised, how she's been taught, and
mm-hmm.
how her parents have been raised and taught. And now she sees African American English and AAVE as not proper English. Would you
Mm-hmm.
say, have you had similar influences, experiences through your schooling?
Like, have I had an experience where I felt I needed to speak a certain way?
When you were younger, did you
Mm-hmm.
ever feel like in school, I went to predominantly white schools
Mm-hmm.
through most of my schooling before I went to an HBCU and started my undergrad in HBCU. I was at a lot of different white schools. So
Mm-hmm.
as a kid, there were times that I did maybe feel similarly to what this person on Twitter is saying. And I felt like, oh, this is wrong. You're not supposed to speak like this. And
Mm-hmm.
people are supposed to speak this proper English in the
Uh,
classroom.
Definitely, actually, I'm just thinking about on a negative aspect of like looking how we look and speaking proper when we were younger. I was often called like an Oreo, where it's
Yeah.
like black on the outside and white on the
Uh,
inside because of how I talk. Or people say, you sound white, or you sound, and it's like
yeah.
it wasn't until I was older where it's like that wasn't like you have to really listen to what they're actually saying and not
Yeah.
like what comes out of their mouth. And I remember how it made me feel because I didn't get it because I was like, what do you mean I
Yeah.
sound white?
What's
What is
talking
that?
white?
Right. And moving forward up until when I started to first get into my linguistic courses and stuff. And it's like I was taught how that can be marginalizing because
Mhm.
it's like they put being white. Now it's not just how you talk, you sounding like this higher person, you know? Um
Exactly. It's like,
yeah.
oh, okay, so being white is better. You say I talk white, you say I talk so proper, and this is
Mhm.
supposed to mean I'm better because I have this feature that you think is close to whiteness.
Yes.
And that's very damaging for a young person. And
Hmm.
then kind of carry that.
There's people that say to me now, "Oh, you're so articulate," and it's like
Oh,
that part that's silent. That for a black girl, that part is silent.
that
Because
part is silent. That part is always silent.
oh,
I've
you're very
heard
well
that.
spoken. I have the ability to form sentences.
Yeah, I have thoughts
Yeah,
and I
I
express
have
them.
thoughts and opinions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so articulate. Why are you surprised?
Hmm.
I had that many times. working, when I was working in Mississippi, that happened to me many times as white customers would come into my bookstore. I would talk to them, and they would be like, "Oh my gosh, wow, you're so articulate. Wow, so surprised." I'd be like, "Yeah, of course," but come to realize, they didn't expect that because majority of the people that worked at my bookstore were Black, so they came in with this certain idea of how we would speak to them, how we would treat them, how we would interact with them, and I guess our level of intelligence as well.
Right.
And
And there's this language bias where individuals who do not conform to the standard language norms that are taught in schools may face some sort of linguistic prejudice where
yeah,
it can impact their self-esteem and thereby hindering their educational progress.
yes, 100%. So linguistic bullying is a term that I read about. I was reading this article by Talamantes. They interview these two children that had recently migrated and were living in El Paso, Texas, and they're Spanish speaking children. And they talk to these children and interview them about their experience in school, if the teachers are helping them, if the students are helping them. And these kids, they don't speak a lot of English yet, and they're so young, they're like in third grade. And interviewing the little girl, she's so heartbroken because in her third grade class, the teacher isn't helping her as much and is kind of saying, well, go to the other students and let the other students help you. But the other students are being rude to her. They're laughing at her because she doesn't understand. They're laughing at her because she can't speak English. So in this interview, she's like crying because she's like, "Oh, I don't have any friends. I can't talk to anyone. No one helps me with my homework. The teachers don't help me, or this specific teacher in third grade isn't able to help me." And she's talking about how it makes her feel like nothing and it makes her feel so worthless.
Mm.
And also heartbreaking for me to read is like the importance of teachers, one, to be like the enforcer and say like this is wrong, and make sure if you're not educating your students on different dialects and different languages and how different people speak and communicate, they're going to become this. They're the ones that are inflicting. Earlier I said that when teachers have these language ideologies that put a certain dialect over another, they're empowering their students to go forth and spread that ideology. And how's that impacting the students at the school, the other students that speak these variety of dialects that aren't the top quote unquote dialects?
Right. I do think that the least we can do as teachers, as educators, as future speech language pathologists is acknowledge that there is some language erosion and how we can promote linguistic diversity. I think, like I said, at the very least, we can acknowledge that it is okay that there are people in the classroom who might not, let's just say English might not be their first or even primary language, and I feel like when you recognize like the importance and value of all languages and including minority languages, I think it maintains a cultural diversity that promotes inclusivity within the classroom environment.
100%. 100%. In my class, my sociolinguistics class, my professor had posed the question, do we think that different dialects should be taught in class, in schools, and in what way? And yeah, please, what are your thoughts?
I think that I wrote something down for this one. If teachers can include multilingualism in the classroom, if they are able to teach in different languages in order to increase comprehension and understanding among the students, I definitely think that they should. If they've never dabbled in the language before, this is a perfect opportunity to do so, because you as the professional, it's your job to increase
Awareness.
Yes, increase awareness, not just among like your classroom, but like among other professionals as well. Like if you like call them out, if you see like if you see a teacher or someone in education saying like, "Oh, I have a student who is so far behind and stuff," but they're an ESOL student. ESOL is English as a second language. Please, I don't want to
right?
get too riled up here.
Get riled up, girl. Uh, but no, 100%. Like it's the teacher's responsibility. That brings me to this other term I read, which is culturally sustaining pedagogy.
Mhm.
And I actually read about this in this article about literacy, but to define culturally sustaining pedagogy, and this is from the California Department of Education. Culturally sustaining pedagogy builds on decades of asset-based pedagogical, sorry, research, including culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive and linguistic pedagogy. And it talks about that curriculum that connects, there needs to be curriculum that connects to cultural and linguistic histories. And educators should be presenting that. Like, as educators, as speech language pathologists, it is our responsibility to help sustain these different cultures, because when we see this language suppression and oppression, that comes with language loss and that comes with culture loss. It's like going down the line, how you're impacting these communities is so huge. And it's so important for educators and speech language pathologists to realize that and put in the work in the
Yeah,
classroom.
and so speaking of putting in the work is in order to bring awareness is not just trying to uh use this multilingualism in the classroom, but also
Uh,
to incorporate in your lessons, like describe how language has been used like in the past and now to exercise power and influence. You know, we talking about
exactly.
the colonialism
Uh-huh.
and how like what happened. I'm not a history person, but like, you know,
Yeah.
like what happened and how we got to where we are now as far
Uh-huh.
as the language that we speak and the cultures that we perform.
Oh, 100%. Like with African Americans, I had just watched this documentary, Talking Black in America. Have you heard of that? It's
That.
on YouTube. It's on YouTube. I will send you the link.
Please.
Talking Black in America. So they talk about how slaves came to America and how the language oppression began in that moment, and on the slave ships separating people that spoke the same language, so they would spend all this time in the transatlantic slave trade like apart and not able to communicate with anyone, and then landfall, get to America, separate them, and of course it's illegal now, it's illegal, you cannot speak your language, and so it starts there. And that's something that can be taught in schools, and it can be taught, like the history in this country of how language has been suppressed for Native American communities, how language has been suppressed for all these different indigenous communities in the school systems, and how school systems continue to uphold these ideas even now in 2023.
Do you think the same people who disagree with critical race theory, do you think that they would be on board for the teaching about the impact of language?
Not
I
ever.
so is this something that can be is there a solution for this specifically in the classroom, talking about, let's
Yeah,
go back to our point here about language and its use in the classroom.
in the
Do
classroom,
you think
yeah.
that there is some sort of, if there is a solution, what is
Mhm.
it and how can we get to there?
I think, that's such a good point, with all this critical race theory stuff going on. How realistic is it that we can put this in the classroom, that we can enforce this and start teaching students about
Mm-hmm.
these different dialects and different languages?
Right,
Yeah,
like
I think it would be very hard because it's like systemically, we as a people, we have a lot to try to overcome. And, it's like already now books about children of color are getting banned. Like our stories are getting erased continuously in the classroom. So it's like that's when we get to the legislative side of being a
mm-hmm.
speech language pathologist, right? And advocacy and doing what you can to advocate for these rights. And so the classroom can change for the betterment of students and the betterment of the future. But I think it's definitely a slow moving process.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I think our goal is progression.
Yes.
It's not, people always say practice makes perfect. No, practice makes progression. You just
Mhm.
you're continuing to move forward.
Inch by inch.
Inch by inch, centimeter
Pushing
by
forward.
centimeter.
Right. And then the pushbacks, I feel like, yeah, with critical, especially with critical race theory in the classroom and the debate around that, I feel like it's a lot of stuff coming back. Like some progress was made and now pushing back against the progress, continue and grapple with that. It's like, okay, let's take 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back throughout all this process. But that's a really good point.
I think
Okay.
that when you said books and stuff are being banned that
Mhm.
showcase our stories and stuff, I think that teachers, if they can, select literature and resources that represent these various languages and cultures and experiences, and include like the students. Like there are all these like projects about tell me about like your culture if it's different, or
Mhm.
I remember I wrote an ethnography my senior year of undergrad. The directions where you have to choose a specific culture that you are not a part of
Mhm.
and write about that, or write the ethnography about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it was such a interesting experience, because like when you talk to people who have different cultures than you, like drastically different, it's
Mhm.
so eye opening, and it's like you realize that the world is so much bigger than the United States.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And that's I think being from the United States and being American, or there's this idea that we are everything. It's like
Mhm.
everyone's thinking about how we're impacted. It's like, oh, how are people in the United States impacted? It's like this ideology that the United States is, I guess, above everything else. But see, I don't
Yeah.
want to strain off topic too much. You go ahead.
But it's also like it's not just people within the United States that think that way. I feel
Mm.
like people who are looking in might see that and see that the United States thinks that they're so much better than everyone else.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like that's also something that is again taught in schools, back to education, this idea that, we have the best ideas and we have the best language, and that goes into it like with the paper I was talking about earlier. These kids are bullying this girl because she speaks Spanish, because what do they think? English is better than Spanish. They're better than her because they speak English.
Right.
Going forward as a speech language pathologist, what do you think you're going to do? What are your actions to try to mitigate this?
Just have it in my mind when collecting data, like when collecting like for baseline and interviewing the parents and caregivers, like is your culture different,
Mhm.
like what are some things that you do that might be different from other households and stuff, and then how that is put into speech and language, put into
Mhm.
your client's speech and language, and how you incorporate that into treatment and intervention,
Mhm.
because knowing that will make the progression in treatment a little bit better.
Yeah, 100%. I think for me, it's like personal research where I'm looking to learn more about these different communities, research where I'm looking to conduct research about these different communities, where the gaps are. So, and education, so I can take that research, what I've learned from other articles, what I've learned from, hopefully one day conducting some of my own research, and take that and educate other clinicians, educate other teachers about the negative impact this has on the children, the negative impact this has on the families. I think that's where I would try to take it.
Yeah,
All right. Thank you so much, Keishan.
you're
Thank you.
welcome.
You had a lot of great points. I very much enjoyed speaking with you today.
Yeah, I enjoyed being here. This is a great conversation. I feel like this is an important conversation. There should be more projects like this wherein we discuss topics like this, because it's important as future SLPs. Believe it or not, there are, because this field is dominated by white women.
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like these conversations are important, and not enough of us are having them.
Oh, not enough at all. Not enough at all. That's a good point. Let's keep having these conversations.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode opens new perspectives on sociolinguistics and the impact that educational settings can have on language. Here's a quote by Dylan Lex. Language is supposed to be something that brings people together. Language is something that is supposed to be felt. It is not something that is supposed to be taken for granted or used lightly. As always, an audio transcription will be available after every episode for any audience members who are deaf or hard of hearing and can be found in the link tree on the S.L.P Project Instagram at S.L.P Project_pod. This is Cashby, soon to be S.L.P, and thanks for listening to the S.L.P Project. Keep going, you've got this. Peace.